Hello everybody, and welcome to a draft level up video. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the role of lands in Limited, but before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, click that bell so you get notified when I post future videos, and leave a comment in the comment section down below with any questions or feedback. If you would like to support my content directly, you can do so via Patreon at patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. And without further ado, let's dive on in. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the math behind lands. There's actually a lot of cool stats you can look up using the hypergeometric calculator, which I will be covering in detail so that you can understand where the reasoning behind this information comes from. Next, I will be talking about how to improve your mana base. Third, I will be talking about how to splash. And finally, I'm going to be talking about snow lands, which is especially relevant given that Kaldheim has snow lands in it. So starting things off with the math, I will say the hypergeometric calculator is your friend. It is very straightforward to use, and I highly recommend it for looking up all sorts of magic-related topics. I used it to come up with the math for this section. I will note that there is a potential chance that I was calculating things in a more simplistic world than maybe you would imagine, but for the sake of this, I'll be explaining how I used it and what I was calculating. So if you want to do more in-depth calculations, you can use the hypergeometric calculator yourself. Just Google it and it comes up. Okie doke, so here's the math. With 17 lands, your opening hand is 89.5% to have 2 or more lands in it. Pretty basic calculation there. And you are 1.63% to have 6+ lands. The reason I chose 2+ and 6+ is because if you have between 2 and 5 lands, then it's generally going to be a keepable hand. And if you have less than 2 lands or 6 or more lands, then you're generally going to have to mulligan. So I factor that into some mathematics later. But for the purposes of this calculation, it's just if you have 17 lands in your deck, these are the odds of having between 2 and 5 lands, essentially. So between 2 or more lands and 6+. If you have 18 lands, which is going a little bit higher on the spectrum, you go to 91.9% chance to have 2+ lands, but your odds of having 6+ lands do go up as well. So you're more likely to flood out, but you're more likely to start off with the lands you need to cast your spells early on. And if you want to go down in the opposite direction with 16 lands, your opening hand is 86.6% to have 2+ lands and a little over 1% to have over 6 or more lands. So you reduce your odds of flooding, but you decrease your consistency of an opening hand. Now, if we assume that there is no color considerations and that your hand is only going to be a mulligan if you have less than 2 lands or more than 5 lands, then these would be the mulligan rates based on the various land counts. So if you have 16 lands, then you're going to be mulliganing 14.5% of the time due to not having enough lands or having too many lands, which is actually kind of a large number, like 1 in 6 times almost, if you have 16 lands. If you have 17 lands, that number goes down by over 2%. And when you think of a percentage point, think of games of Magic. So if I played 100 games of Magic, 12 of them I'm going to have to mulligan if I have 17 lands, but I'm going to have to mulligan 14.5 if I have 16 lands. And this isn't factoring in colors yet, I'll get to that later. And if I have 18 lands, that number goes further down. It goes to 10.5%. You'll notice that it's not strictly linear because the number of hands that have too many lands will also go up when I increase my land count. And then just for interest, if I go up to 19 lands, then I have to mulligan only 9.5% of my hands. But as you see, the more lands I add, the less of a benefit I get. So if we're going from 14.5 to 12.1, that's a 2.4% change. But going from 12.1 to 10.5, that's only a 1.6% difference. And then you only get a 1% difference if you add that extra land. So there are diminishing returns to adding additional lands in terms of your mulligan rates. Now, this is a lot of numbers, but essentially what it's saying is that 17 lands is a pretty good sweet spot between all these numbers because you get a nice little return for adding that 17th land compared to your 16th land. And I haven't calculated flood rates because flooding is going to depend on the deck very much so, because if you have a cheap converted mana cost, then you don't need as many lands to function. But and so you're not going to flooding is going to be a little bit different. But in terms of mulligan rates, in mulliganing, we can assume has a large impact on your win percentage in the game. You don't want to be mulliganing, so 17 lands is a pretty nice sweet spot. 18 lands is a pretty decent spot as well if you have extra ways to use those lands. Okie doke, so now let's consider a 9/8 mana base. We're going to start talking about the colors of mana in your deck. With 9 sources of a color, in your opening hand is 85.9% to have 1 or more of that color. So if you have 9 mountains in your deck, you have pretty good odds of having a mountain in your opening hand. If you have 8 sources of a color, you're 81.9% to have one of that color in your hand. So if you have a 9/8 mana base, you're over 80% to have one of each color. You are over 80% to have those colors in your hand. So if you have a 9/8 mana base with islands and mountains, then you're like 4/5 of the time, a little bit more, you're going to have an island, and over a little bit more than 4/5 of the time, you're going to have a mountain. So pretty interesting stuff there. If you have a 10/7 mana base, it gets a little bit more skewed. You're almost 90% to have the color of your 10 sources. You're 89.1%. And if you have 7 sources, your opening hand goes down into the 70%, so 77.1%. So if you remember the numbers from before, it basically adds or subtracts 4%, a little bit more in the case of going down to 7, because of those diminishing returns we talked about earlier. So going from 7 to 8 has a little bit more of a sizable impact than going from 9 to 10. Conclusions. Let's look at some of these. A 9/8 split lacks both colors in 32.2% of openers. So that's a pretty wild amount. It means that you're going to have to keep some number of hands that have only islands when you have a blue-red deck, or only forests when you have a black-green deck. Those are the sorts of things you're going to have to sacrifice, because you can't just mulligan every hand that lacks both colors. You have to mulligan a lot of those hands, but keeping in mind that if you're looking at your 7-card hand and trying to determine whether you can keep it or not, not having both colors is a major factor in whether or not you mulligan. So if you think about that and you combine it with the mulligan ratios from before, just from not having enough lands or from having too many lands, you can start to see that there are some major detriments in a mana base towards mulliganing. 32% is a large number. With a 10/7 split, you are going to lack both colors in 33.8% of openers. When I say lack both colors, I mean you don't have at least one of each color. You're going to have one or the other. Obviously, it would be really tough to not have lands of either colors. But you can see that that's not a super meaningful gain in lacking both colors. It's only like about a 1.5% gain in lacking both colors, but you do get that extra consistency from having that one color that you really want more. So you're going to get like a 4% gain in having planes if you're playing a 10/7 split and really just need your white sources, and you're gonna still have both colors in a lot of your openers, but you do get that nice little edge from having more planes in your opener. The way that I calculated this was by just adding up the percent chance of not having one of those lands. So the way it would work is you would have like a 9% chance of not 11, it was close to an 11% chance pretty much of not having a colored source. But yeah, for your 10 source, as we can see from this number, it's like an 11% chance of not having one. This is a 23% chance of not having one. And so when you add them together, it's roughly similar, but you're far more likely to have the color of your 10 source. So it can be pretty beneficial to you, as we'll cover later. Now we'll consider the Devil's Mana Base, which is a common term for a 6/6/6 split if someone is new to draft and they're trying to play 3 colors. With 6 sources, your opening hand is only 71% to have one of that color, which means that if you have a 6/6/6 mana base, you're 86 or almost 87% to be missing a color in your opening hand, which is quite detrimental, as you can imagine, because it means you're going to either not be able to play your spells, which is the more likely outcome, or you're going to have to mulligan. But you can't really mulligan, because when the odds are this stacked against you, trying to mulligan to a hand that has all 3 of your colors is going to be really tricky. Okay, so now we're going to consider a mana base with a splash. If you have 3 sources of a color, you're 44, almost 45% to have one of that color in your opener. So you're not super likely to have it in your opening hand, but if you go to the first 15 cards in your deck, which is roughly turn 8, depending on how many draws you have in your deck, because you're 15 cards deep, you go to almost a little bit over 3/4% chance to have one of that color. So that's why oftentimes when you're talking to someone and they're saying, oh, if you're going to splash a card, you want it to be a card that you can play later in the game, it's because oftentimes you won't have the mana to cast it until later. If you have 4 sources of a color for your splash, you're a little bit over 50% to have one of that color in your opener. If you remember, as I said, there's diminishing returns to adding extra sources. That doesn't mean you don't want to have more sources, obviously, but as you can see, there was a massive jump. So with 3 sources, you were 45% chance almost, and with 4 sources, you're a 55%. So you get like a 10% boost for adding that extra 4th source. Typically, you're going to be running 3 sources just because it's going to have an adverse effect on your other colors if you go to other sources. But if you're in 55% chance to have one in your opener, and if you're splashing correctly, and if you're 15 cards deep, you're 86. So you're pretty likely to have it in the first 8 turns of the game, roughly. So 3 to 4 sources is generally what you're looking for with a splash. I will also say that if you're splashing more than one card, going up to 4 sources is pretty nice because you don't want to be cut off of casting multiple cards in your hand at a time. Additionally, there will sometimes be cards that will function as like, you can treat them as like half a source. So a card that can tap for that sort of color of mana, it might not count as a full source because it might be like an expensive thing like a Prismite where you have to pay 2 into it to get one of the other color out, so that it will be impacted, but it can sometimes count as like half a source, so you can get those numbers somewhere between 3 and 4. Okay, so here are the takeaways from the math that I want you to get out of them. Even if you didn't understand all the mathematics, how it worked out, I encourage you to plug those numbers into the hypergeometric calculator yourself. But here are the main takeaways. Many games are impacted by your mana. This is just something that hopefully was evident. There's a lot of games you have to mulligan because you don't have the right colors of mana or you don't have the right number of lands in your opening hand. And then you can also improving your mana should be a priority because that's just a major area. If you assume that every game you mulligan, you take like a 10% hit in your win percentage, that's not too far off. I don't know the exact number, but there was a study I think that showed that you took a pretty sizable chunk out of your win percentage whenever you mulliganed. This was maybe before they changed the mulligan rules around, but you take a massive hit to your win percentage every time you mulligan. And so if you can improve your mana to make yourself mulligan less, you're naturally going to win more games, even if it feels like your deck isn't getting more powerful. So oftentimes it's hard to figure, oh, my deck has this dual land in it, so it got meaningfully better. But if you then think about, if you're playing 100 games of Magic over the long run, you're going to have to mulligan in like, say, 4% less games, and that's 4 games where you have 10% better chance of winning or something like that, or however many games it adds up to be. But it can be making a meaningful difference in your matches if you improve your mana. So now let's talk about how to improve your mana. First up, prioritize dual lands. These are lands that come into play tapped, oftentimes in limited, and sorry about that. These often come into play tapped in limited, but they'll be able to tap for multiple colors. And then sometimes there'll be rare lands that tap for 2 colors and come in untapped if you meet some certain condition. So prioritizing dual lands adds to your color sources without increasing your flood rate. I didn't actually calculate a flood rate because, as I said, it does matter what sort of deck you're drafting, and that would have gone into a lot more numbers. Maybe I could do that in a different video if people want. But there is presumably a flood rate to adding more lands. That's why you don't run 19 lands, because you don't get as much benefit as 17 lands for your opening hand, but you will flood out more in more games if you have 19 lands in your deck. But adding color sources without increasing your flood rate is really nice for a dual land, because it also makes those, instead of having a 9/8 mana base, you essentially have a 9/9 mana base because one of your lands taps for both colors. It's also a low opportunity cost to take a dual land because there are more playables in current sets. So the way you need to evaluate a dual land is how much better is this dual land going to be than a basic land, which is sizably better. Then this card is going to be the like playable card for your deck that you're taking is going to be for the next best card. So if you're taking a medium playable card, the land is going to be much better than a basic land, but the medium playable is going to be basically interchangeable with whichever other medium playable that you end up with. Just imagine all of your draft decks, how you always end up with oftentimes you'll end up with a couple of cards in your sideboard that you'd be totally fine with playing in the main deck. And if you could replace those with dual lands that would actively increase your and make your mana base better, then you would be happy to do that. So there's a low opportunity cost to taking the lands. And entering tapped is a low price to pay for consistency. So dual lands often enter tapped, but that is a pretty low cost overall when you think about how many percentage points you gain by just having those extra color sources. Next is prioritize one color. This means that if you're in a draft portion and you can try to bias your deck towards heavy in one color, it could really provide you a benefit down the line in terms of your mana. So it makes you less reliant on having both colors in your opener. All of a sudden, instead of the 33% of games where you have to mulligan or potentially consider a mulligan because you don't have both a swamp and a forest, your deck that is very heavy in green only has like a 10% chance of not having a forest. So you're way more likely to be able to carry on and keep your hands if you are prioritizing one color. It lets you play a 10-7 split. Sometimes you can even go into 11-6 or further if you have only a couple of cards, and then it's like almost as if you're just splashing your second color, but you're doing it with like 6 sources or something like that. But playing a 10-7 split or better can be quite beneficial, and it lets you keep more hands. That's really the priority behind improving your mana base, is it lets you keep more hands, play more games of Magic, because mulliganing is really bad and something we're trying to avoid here. Number 3, prioritize utility lands. This is a really key aspect as well. One of the cool things you can do with a utility land is if it has some sort of mana sink built in, you can oftentimes up your land count to 18 lands from 17, because you know that some number of your lands are going to provide an extra effect when you have them on the battlefield. So if you have a utility land that you can sacrifice for some benefit, then all of a sudden playing an 18th land is not unappealing. And you're going to be able to reap the benefits of the 18 lands in the Keep Your Mulligan decision, because you're going to be able to play that utility land in your opening hand and not fall into the less than 2 camp when it comes to mulliganing hands, or more than 6, because sometimes you can even treat your utility land as a spell when you're in those situations. So you're going to have to mulligan less hands due to the number of lands you have, and you're going to have extra flood protection in the late game, which is really quite nice. So basically, prioritizing utility lands reduces your flood rate. It can enable higher land counts. And wow, it's funny, I talked about all those things because I thought I forgot exactly what I put on those, which is funny because I made these quite recently, and by quite recently I mean today. But it reduces your flood rate. It can enable higher land counts. There is the exception: colorless lands have a much higher bar to clear. Oftentimes you won't want to necessarily replace in a 17 land deck. You're not always going to want to replace a 17 land your 17th land with a colorless land, because it'll just hurt your colored sources. It just takes away 4% from your odds of having a particular color in your opening hand, which is sometimes too much, especially if you need to hit double of a color. I don't really talk about this here, but as much. But if you have cards in your deck that are double green to cast or double black to cast, for a lot of removal spells, you'll have to have cast of them for double black or something. And if you have cards like that, then you all of a sudden want even more colored sources of that color, because you are going to need to get 2 sources of that to cast your spells. So colorless lands have a much higher bar to clear, and we'll cover that with some examples in a little bit. Finally, when it comes to splashing, you want to look for 3 or 4 sources, as we talked about in the mathematics section. Prioritize sources with minimal impact on your other colors. This would include something like a dual land that is one of your main colors. So if you're playing a red-green deck and you have a blue-red land, dual land, that helps you splash blue without actually taking away from a red source. So those are the sorts of things you want to be on the lookout for when splashing. And then finally, if you don't get the mana, don't splash. It's just not worth it. It really can hurt your win percentage in a major way if you try to splash cards that you can't afford. As you saw with the 6/6/6 mana base, when you get to that point, it can really have a negative impact on your mulligan rate and therefore your win rate. Okie doke, so now we're going to talk about snow lands, particularly because Kaldheim features them as a mechanic, and there's also other mechanics that are kind of similar in other sets. What are the snow lands? Snow lands are special lands, and in Kaldheim they replace the basic land in a pack, which means that instead of having a basic land, you'll be able to take a snow land for your deck. And there are also snow dual lands that replace the basic lands at some frequency. So they fuel an archetype within the set, often known as snow payoffs. So there are going to be cards within a set that say if you have snow permanents, and of course your snow lands count as snow permanents. Why should you take these snow lands? Well, snow lands are spell amplifiers, and the way you can imagine them is that they provide you benefit for your spells. Gaining power from your mana lets you compete on an axis that many opponents can't match. So basically, your snow lands are going to boost your other spells with small benefits. And even though those benefits are small in individually, if you have 3 or 4 snow lands, sometimes those benefits can actually be making a meaningful impact. So for the case of if you've never interacted with snowlands before, imagine if all of your lands entered untapped and gained you 1 life. You just have a 9/8 mana base of islands and mountains, but every mountain you play gains you a life. Now, I had something in my throat. Now, that's not going to individually win you the game. Your opponent can still take over the board, kill all your cards and then hit you with creatures, but over the course of the game, you're going to gain 6 extra life or so, and snowlands are like that, as they provide small benefits for many payoff cards. So if you are drafting your deck and you can fit a couple of snowlands in there, all of a sudden you have all of your cards that care about snow being a little bit better and giving you those extra little benefits that can help you swing a game, because it might not be just like with the entering untapped and gaining a life, those might not win you the game all the time, but there are going to be games where you end the race at 2 life points and you gained 3 life from snow, and that like saved you from your opponent's last burn spell or something like that, their like last ping or something like that. So they are a major payoff, and they are worth taking. Next, when should you take them? Know which colors care more about snow is a key component of when you should take them. In different formats, it's going to vary. So sometimes it's going to be blue-green decks. Sometimes it might be more red-green decks. In Kaldheim, I think all of the colors care about snow to some degree. So you're going to want to, but you're going to want to know like which ones have like commons that care about it, which ones have uncommons rather than just like rare payoffs or some things like that. Knowing which colors care about snow is a big deal because you're going to prioritize them more if they're colors that care. So if blue is the snow color, taking a snow island out of the pack might be much more relevant than taking a snow plains or something of that nature. Next, you want to take the snowlands even before you have payoffs, as they open you up for payoffs later. This is really important. The way that snow often works is somebody will prioritize the snowlands as they should be doing, and they'll take snowlands early in pack 1, and the other players who haven't opened a snow payoff maybe don't take any snowlands, and then in pack 2 you open a sweet uncommon or sweet rare that really cares about snow and would pay you off for it, but you don't have the lands, and so all of a sudden you then have to make a balancing act where if you do take that rare, all of a sudden all of your other picks, you have to start prioritizing snow to an unhealthy level at certain points. So you might have a good common, but you have to take the snowland to make your rare work. And those are more difficult decisions than in pack 1. If you see a snowland over a medium card, you're like, well, there's a snowland, there's a medium card. I'm going to take, sorry about that. I'm going to take the snowland because I know that if I get a snow payoff later, I'm going to want this snowland. And then finally, you just basically take the snowlands over replacement level cards. This is because they can make your deck meaningfully better if you have a certain number of snowlands, a critical number of them, whereas replacement level cards, oftentimes you're going to have a couple of those on the bench that you can just as easily slot into your deck. Okie doke, other notes on snow. There is 1 snowland in every pack, so you can read a signal if it is missing. If you get past your first pack from the person sitting next to you and you see that there is no land in it, you know that they took the snowland, and so you can think, well, they're going hard on snow. Maybe I should try to avoid, because if they're taking all the snowlands, all of the snow cards are going to get worse for you. This can factor in, like sometimes in the middle of the draft, you're like, okay, it's pick 4. There's a good card here, but there's a snowland missing. So they are taking the snowland over this very good card, which maybe gives you some insight into the strategy they're going for, which is even more relevant if certain color combinations are more likely to go for snow. So if blue-green is the only color combination that cares about snow, or red-green or some combination of colors, like say, let's just for this example say like red, blue, and green care about snow, and white and black don't care at all, and you get past a pack that has a good black card and no snowland, you can think, okay, someone passing to me took this snowland over the black card, which means there's somebody on that side that's potentially drafting snow. You don't get to know like which person unless it's like literally the second pick, but that's just something you can factor in. And then finally, some snow payoffs are solid without snow, so recognize how much snow support you will need. There are cards that are just going to be playable spells and then give you a little bit of extra upside for having snow, and then there are some cards that are just stone cold unplayable if you don't have snow. So when you're taking cards that care about snow, you can kind of factor that in. If you say like pack 2, you can maybe think, well, it's pack 2, I'm not going to have as much have a chance to pick up snowlands. I only have 1 so far. This card really needs me to have like 6, so maybe I don't take this card because I'm not going to be able to get the snowlands. Or you can think, oh, this card's good even without snow. I can take this card and know that even if I don't get a ton of snowlands, it's still going to be solid. And then finally, there are other land types like artifact lands from the Mirrodin blocks, or wastes from the Battle for Zendikar. Actually, it was Oath of the Gatewatch that had wastes, and they can be evaluated in a similar way. I don't think artifact lands actually replaced basic land slots, but wastes certainly did, and you have to like prioritize them in the draft portion and things like that. So just because there haven't been like enchantment lands or things like that in the past, doesn't mean that there won't be in the future. So you can evaluate other cards that are similar to snowlands in the same way, in that they amplify your spells, they give you benefit, take them over medium replacement level cards in your drafts. Finally, some Kaldheim examples. So Kaldheim has snow basics, so snow-covered islands, they do count as basic lands. And then they are also introducing snow lands that are cards like Highland Forest, which is a mountain forest, enters tapped, and it counts as a snowland. So this Highland Forest will count on both axes. It will both help your colors, and by adding that extra source of a dual land, and also help your snow payoffs. So these are actually quite good, and they can also help you splash or things of that nature. And because it has both of the land types, mountain forest, you can actually search it up if you have an ability that lets you search for for a forest or a mountain, which is something to keep in mind. And then there's also a card like Shimmerdrift Veil, which is not a dual land, but it does help you fix your colors because it can tap for any color, and it is also a snow land. So these are the sorts of things where you might want to prioritize these cards a little bit higher than you think on first glance, because they do help unlock a lot of the other cards in the set for you. Looking at some examples of snow payoffs in the set, Frostbite falls into the camp of this card is like a solid card that gets even better when you have snow, because it's a single red mana to deal 2, and if you have 3 snow permanents, so oftentimes 3 snow lands are going to be your snow permanents, it'll deal 3 damage, which is a nice little bit of an upside. On the other hand, Spirit of the Alderguard is a basically unplayable card if you don't have the snow lands to back it up, because it's a 4 mana 0/4 that just doesn't do anything if you have no snow lands. I guess it could get a little bit of a benefit from you having other snow creatures, but generally like a really unplayable card. But if you have, say, 8 snow lands in your deck, then all of a sudden Spirit of the Alderguard is going to be like a 4 mana 5/4 that draws you a land from your deck, and it can even like help you fix your mana. So all of a sudden it becomes a very good card. And so these are just pretty much the exact case of Frostbite is a solid is a solid card that gets better with snow, and Spirit of the Alderguard is a card that's really bad unless you have snow. So these are the sorts of things to keep in mind when thinking about snow mana. Also, here are some examples of colorless lands. Oftentimes colorless lands are at rare, though there are sometimes cases where they are at uncommon or things like that. Looking at Tyrite Sanctum, this is the sort of card that's not really worth putting in your mana base because it has such a marginal impact on the game. In Limited, you're not going to be having a god all that often in your decks, and it's going to be, even if you have a god, putting a land that's going to like reduce your odds of having one of your colored sources by like 4%, or 4 out of every 100 games you're going to get a little bit color screwed because you don't have that land, is going to be a pretty big deal. So you don't want to be putting a card like Tyrite Sanctum in your deck, because it's going to be having a negative, it's going to not give you enough benefit in the games where it works compared to the situations where it deprives you of the colored source that you need. On the other hand, Faceless Haven has a little bit more upside because it's a snow land, so you might want it for the snow reasons. You also might be able to activate it, but it's also the type of card that is going to have marginal upside. If your deck only has 6 snow lands in it, Faceless Haven's oftentimes going to be hard to activate, and putting a colorless source in your deck is really tough to justify sometimes. If you have enough snow payoffs, I could see it being worth it. If you have enough other snow lands, I could see it being worth it. Oftentimes, you'll maybe want to play Faceless Haven as your 18th land, because you know that in the mid game, if you do have a bunch of lands in play, Faceless Haven is going to be essentially a creature on the board. So that you can activate on both turns. So it does get that little bit of upside if you have enough snow lands to support it. But it just goes to show that even though these cards may look powerful, they have a lot of abilities, they're rares, they're oftentimes not going to be worth it to include in your limited mana base, because putting a colorless source in your deck is quite tricky to justify, given those percentages we looked at earlier, where you take a major hit to your mana if you are playing a colorless land. And then finally, here are some examples of the types of like utility lands that you're really looking for and can maybe help you justify running that 18th land. So something like Gates of Istvel, if you get to the mid game and you have a bunch of lands in play, all of a sudden you can sacrifice it to gain two life and draw 2 cards, which is just a really nice thing to have on your land. So maybe you play 18 lands because you know if you draw Gates of Istvel, it's going to actually function as a spell in the situations where you have too many lands. Similarly, Notvold Slumbermound, it may be really expensive to use, but it creates you a meaningful creature when you're flooding out. A 4/4 with Trample is oftentimes going to be a relevant body on the board, even in the mid game. And so these are the sorts of lands that you can put into your deck and say, okay, now I can afford to add an extra land to my mana base so that I all of a sudden am not going to be having to mulligan as much, or all of a sudden I'll be able to curve out a little bit easier because I'll be hitting my lands more consistently. I'll be able to play my 5-drops on curve more often, those sorts of things. So when you can prioritize this sort of utility land, it can be quite powerful. So, what have we learned today? Remember that the math shows limited mana bases are weak. There are many cases where you're going to have to mulligan because of your mana base, and so you're going to want to improve your mana base whenever possible by making sure your colors work out and things of that nature. You can take real steps to improve your mana. As I was discussing in that section of the video, you can prioritize one color. You can prioritize like dual lands. You can take utility lands a little bit higher, because dual utility and snow lands are powerful and worth prioritizing. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed this guide on the role of lands in Limited, how to use lands to maximize your win percentage. and get the most value out of them as you can. It can be a slightly mathematical concept. It can be one of those concepts that's hard to grasp, but hopefully, even if the math was a little confusing, you understand that it is a major cost to have bad mana. There are steps you can take to make your mana better, and having better mana is going to lead to more wins, even if it's not as tangible as maybe slamming a bomb rare or something like that. You can get more wins just by playing your creatures on curve a little bit more often, mulliganing a little bit less, and flooding out a little bit less as well. If you did make it all the way to the end of the video, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, click that bell so you get notified when I post future videos, and comment if you have questions or feedback, and leave a hashtag Landmaster in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video. That's just a little bit of a Falco reference from Super Smash Bros. Brawl, because he always says Landmaster when he uses his Brawl ability, so a little bit of a not callback, a little bit of a sweet reference for those of you who get that one. But that is going to do it for this draft video. Remember that you can support me directly on Patreon. If you are enjoying these sorts of videos, you can check that out linked below. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again for watching, and I will talk to you folks next time.